1975 Sky Saw from Brian Eno. That's from Another Green World, and featuring interesting assortment of musicians. John Cale on viola, the viola section, Phil Collins on drums, Percy Jones on fretless bass, Brian Eno on what he calls snake guitar and digital guitar. I'm Chris Douridas. You're listening to Morning Becomes Eclectic. It's a pleasure to have you here, Brian.
Hello.
Welcome back to KCRW.
I haven't left since last night.
Yeah, you should have just, put up a sleeping bag here in the studio. And
well, I did, actually. It's much cheaper than getting a hotel.
Yeah. Hopefully people got to hear the lengthy visit with you last night on Tom Schnabel's Evening Becomes Eclectic. And then right after that, you headed out to K-Rock across town and did Love Lines, which must have been a fascinating experience.
Well, it's certainly an original radio show, I must say. I would have liked to have heard more comments from people calling in, more. There was a lot of banter, but not very many actual attempts to help anyone, which I thought was the idea. But it's a very good idea. It's a very interesting concept for a show. And it was quite funny. One of the things that was funny was that they kept leaving the studio to go and piss or have cups of tea or something like that. And then the record would run out and I'd be there on my own, faced with a desk not unlike yours, but I'd never operated one of those before.
Well, basically the concept of the show, and I guess the way they sold it to you, was a show that would give advice to teenagers and be mixed with music and conversation.
Well, I'd say it's a show that presents music and conversation and intersperses it with abuse for teenagers, really. Advice and abuse. But I mean, the people calling in obviously were perfectly happy with the arrangement and enjoyed the thing that they found themselves being part of.
Right. Well,
I enjoyed doing it, actually. Yeah, I did.
It sounded as though you did, yeah. We're going to, in a few minutes, hear work from a couple different projects that you've recently completed. Before we do, I want to remind listeners of one of the tunes that you put together for Wrong Way Up, which was a collaborative project with John Cale that came out on Warner Brothers about 2 years ago. This was a song that apparently grew out of your learning of the Spanish language.
My attempts to learn the Spanish language. I've had this book for about 25 years called Spanish in 3 months. And one of the interesting things about it is that I think that it was probably written by a frustrated poet, in that the collections of sentences which are supposed to exercise your grammar in fact connect together in very obscure ways. They make strange little stories, and they're presented as independent sentences which are, meant to sort of test your grasp of the subjunctive or the infinitives or something like that. But in fact, they make little stories. If you just leave a few sentences out, you get these very strange stories. So I think this is a frustrated novelist or poet whose only outlet is writing Spanish books, you see. And this particular song, Cordoba, is almost a verbatim transcription of one of the Spanish lessons, lesson 43, on page 64, as I recall. I can't remember now how it goes. It's such a long time.
Brian Eno with John Cale on KCRW. John Cale and Brian Eno from the Opal Warner Brothers release from 1990 called Wrong Way Up. I'm Chris Douridas. You're listening to Morning Becomes Eclectic, and in the studio with us, I'm happy to say, is Brian Eno. Good to have you here again, I should mention.
Thanks.
A source of constant fascination for you seems to be the manner in which people pay attention or fail to pay attention to their surroundings, to media, to culture, to each other, and especially to opportunity or chance. And it's that last element that I think has really defined you in a way, the way you pay attention to chance and the way you make opportunity work for you. You once quoted Louis Pasteur, who wrote that chance favors the prepared observer, and that seems to be a vital tenet of your being.
Well, my follow-on from the Pasteur quote is, luck is being ready. Because when I first started out and first started making any success in music, people would always say, boy, you're so lucky, in a kind of resentful way, as if things had all happened to me, and I hadn't sort of learnt to play anything, and it had all been just a series of wonderful accidents. And I thought, yes, I suppose I am lucky. But then I thought, but what does luck actually consist of? And I think people who are lucky are actually people who are in some way, or who are consistently lucky again and again, are people who are alert and are keeping their eyes open for opportunities. Now, normally what happens with people who are very carefully trained in a particular form is that they tend to become very focused on a set of ways of doing things, and on a set of goals for which one might do those things. If you're not particularly trained for anything, which I wasn't, I was trained to be a painter, which didn't help me much in the nuts and bolts of being a musician. If you're not trained, you tend to keep your eyes open and to watch when things start to go right, however that happens to be, or when they start to seem promising or interesting, and then you just put all your resources behind that. Now, I think that people who are highly trained aren't willing to abandon the techniques that they know so readily. If you're not highly trained, you don't have anything to abandon. You don't have a backlog of techniques and expectations. You just go with whatever looks promising at the time. So, luck is being ready. That's my motto.
In a way, it seems as though we'd be better at rethinking the way we educate our kids and the way we educate our society. To stand back and I don't know, maybe rethink the parameters that we put into an educational process.
Yes, it's a very difficult problem, because Bill and I were talking about this the other night. That you nearly always know that what you're educating people for is, or what you're educating them in, is probably going to be of absolutely no use for them. And that the things that they'll learn that are useful are probably things that they'll learn from their friends and from their activities within society, But it's also very difficult to devise an educational system which is based on the idea of saying to people, hey, just keep your eyes open. I think it's possible, it's imaginable, but it doesn't mesh very well with a system that wants educational qualifications. In England we have a big crisis at the moment because there's more and more push from the right wing of the Conservative Party to create more and more stratified educational systems and more examinations at various points in a child's career. And the theory is that this will allow employers to more accurately choose people who are suited to jobs and so on. But of course what it does, it more and more encourages educationalists to focus their work towards what will get good examination results. And so it's producing people who are certainly more clever, but certainly less intelligent, I think. And it produces a sort of, I think, a rather bookish, technocratic group of people. Rather like the Japanese education system does. I think that's a very good example of how you run an education system if you want a successful economy without too much brilliance in it. That's rather what it seems to me has happened there.
Like the Metropolis Society in the film Metropolis.
Yeah, that's a bit extreme. I wouldn't compare Japan to Metropolis, but I was talking to the head of research at Sony once, and he said, well, Japan's interesting because it has the highest median intelligence, the highest average IQ, I should say, not intelligence. But it also has the smallest range of IQ of any developed country. So what that means is that the educational system, by demanding such obedience and by being able to produce such guilt and conformity in its students, does actually succeed in elevating examination results quite significantly. But it also seems to succeed in suppressing real idiosyncratic thoughts. Real extraordinary students are not encouraged by such a system. So I suppose any educational system is really deciding where you want to be on that axis of possibilities.
I think we'll come back to before we're through here. We'll come back to the area of education and touch on some things that you've been working on that act as some ways of adding on to educational ideas. First, I want to ask you. I guess it was last January, that we were expecting a new record from you, My Squelchy Life.
September.
Was it September, the first one? And then
that's when I was expecting it.
You were expecting it in September, and then there were various release dates that were set earlier through 1992. Then the schedule, did some changes, and you apparently did some rethinking of your new album work. Can you let us in on that process?
Yes. Well, when I make something, no, I have to start before that. I don't see pieces of music or pictures or films or anything else as existing separate from the time that they're made in. And I've always seen myself as somewhat topical, in the sense that what I do and what I'm interested in at any given moment is not entirely to do just with its own independent set of terms. It's to do with how it relates to everything else that's going on. It's very important for me that something is released within the context, the temporal and cultural context within which I construed it. For instance, I wouldn't today release any of the records I've made in the past. It doesn't mean I don't like them. It's just that I wouldn't do them that way now. If I were to approach any of those projects now, if they even seemed valid as projects to me, I would make something different, because the rest of the world has changed, Now, I made that record on the understanding of a particular release date, which was September last year. That was rescheduled because of the fact that every well-known artist in the world was also releasing a record in September last year, and it was assumed, quite rightly, I think, that mine wouldn't have garnered that much attention in that context. So I said, well, that's okay, but I'll have to remake the record, because I don't want something released February next year that's already several months old for me. I won't be able to support it. I can only really talk convincingly about the things that are sort of at the top of my mind now and that interest me now. I can't even remember things I did 2 years ago sometimes. It's another world for me, It doesn't mean I don't like them. I absolutely love them, but they're made by somebody else, as far as I'm concerned. They're not made by this me now. And to think about them is sort of an effort. I have to really think myself back to that and imagine myself not knowing then what I know now, sort of thing. Subtract certain bits in order to talk about them convincingly.
You're listening to Morning Becomes Eclectic on KCRW. I'm Chris Douridas. We have in the studio Brian Eno. We've been hearing underneath the conversation here works from the new release that's due out in late October. It's called the Shutov Assembly, and that'll be out, I think, October 24th is when it's set to be issued. This week, though, in stores, you can find NerveNet. It's a brand new release of songs, works, pieces from Brian Eno. We're going to start off here with Ali Click. From NerveNet, that's called Ali Click. I'm Chris Douridas. You're listening to Morning Becomes Eclectic on KCRW. We have in the studio Brian Eno. NerveNet is in stores this week on Opal Warner Brothers Records. Brian, you were just mentioning that the drum track on this piece that we just heard was actually something that you had lifted from an EMF tune that you remixed.
That's right, yes, it's unbelievable. Do you know that song?
Yeah, we actually played it to start the show this morning.
Well, I never. What a stroke of coinky-dinky.
Yeah. But this is something that you do quite often, where you'll take tracks from old things you've worked on and I guess kind of your old trash in a way, or your old scraps. It's like scrap metal heaps. And
I'm a great composter. You know, the idea of compost heaps where you don't waste anything. It keeps going back on the garden again and again.
Yeah.
That's what I like to do with old tapes as well. And of course I'm always generating material that don't have any current use for, just a beautiful, strange sound or something like that. It sits around in my library until I need it.
How big must your library be? You must have a whole warehouse or something.
I've got a lot of stuff, yes. I mean, I don't know really. I've never worked out in hours, but if you figure that I've released in my... Let me see, I guess I've released about 1,000 minutes of music, and I must have probably 1,000 times as much as that. 500 or 1,000 times as much as that.
I think it's really interesting, the words that are going on in the piece we just heard, the kind of rap-like quality to it, and your approach to writing lyrics, and your advice to anybody who is attempting to write lyrics has been for them to be a channel for the ideas. You say you don't necessarily need to try to understand what the words are. Mm-hmm. You may not know what the words really mean for years to come, if even then. Mm-hmm. And that you just try to be prepared to sing the words that you think should be sung.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the great problems of rock music is lyrics, actually, and they so often let down the music. Fortunately, I'm almost deaf to lyrics. I've got records that I've had for 25 years, and I still don't know what they say. I'm just so uninterested in hearing what they're singing about that I don't hear, or I misinterpret it. Like only a few weeks ago, I discovered that an old Birds song that I'd always sung in a particular way is in fact saying something quite different, and something quite a lot less interesting, actually. I'd misheard it and turned it into words which I thought were very odd and interesting. They're not odd at all, actually. They're quite normal in real life.
Is that the same approach for you with music then too, when you lay down music and put together tunes, build tunes and things, that you don't necessarily know what it is you're about until it's done, or even years later? Or
that's normally the case, yes. I mean, I'm happy to be a theoretician, but I nearly always theorize after the event. So it always works that I start out on things and sort of follow my nose and follow what interests me without being too critical about why it should interest me. You know, I don't generally censor that interest. I don't say, this isn't the kind of thing I ought to be doing, you know. I follow it, and then if it continues to pay off in some way, if it continues to open up things for me, it's then that I start trying to assess it and to say, well, I wonder where this fits within the history of my own work and within the culture at large, actually. This is always considered to be an arrogant question for people to ask, but it's the most interesting one for me, to see where what you're doing locates you within a larger fabric of culture. And with pop music, that's very interesting, because it hasn't traditionally been seen as integratable in the larger culture. You know, it was always seen as a marginal, ephemeral, topical and sort of vulgar form. And at the centre of culture, of course, were always located the Royal Shakespeare Company and the Opera House and the great novelists and so on. But I think that picture is quite out of date now. I think, first of all, I think there isn't really a hard centre to our culture. It's rather like, the situation now is rather like that described in the book called Edge City. Have you heard of that book?
No.
It's by an American, I think his name is Joel Jarrow. He's writing about the development of cities in America and saying that more and more centres are being abandoned and suburbs are the places where people live. And so you get a ring of small cities surrounding an empty centre.
It certainly sounds like Los Angeles.
Well, I think it's true in a lot of big cities in America, actually, where both life and work are conducted at the edges now. Well, I think that's a good picture of how our culture works. There are lots of centres of culture, and none of them actually can make a claim to greater importance than any other. And I remember reading an art review, 8 years ago, where a critic was attempting to dignify the work of Keith Haring by saying that unlike most popular art, it was not topical, relative, or vulgar. And I thought, yes, that really does mark the difference, because what I'm most interested in are things that are topical, relative, and vulgar. That's really why I'm not interested in being a fine artist, because the striving for universality and profundity and longevity has produced so much pompous work in the fine art scene. And I'm really very happy not to be involved with that. It's the background I come from, but it's, to me, so joyless now that I'm really happy to be involved in a medium that people can be irreverent about and have a good time with.
And you came up into the music world in a sort of irreverent way of sorts. You weren't classically trained. You actually weren't formally schooled in music.
That's right, yes. Of course, a lot of other pop musicians aren't either, and especially in England. A lot of us come out of art schools.
Yeah.
That used to be the case more. Now the art schools have suffered the same restrictions that I was explaining about the rest of the education system, so they have actually become rather less interesting places than they used to be. For instance, you now need quite good academic qualifications to go into art school. This immediately cuts out a lot of the most interesting art students, because they often are the people who weren't very good at those other things for some reason or another, who didn't have the kind of mind that could handle English literature and mathematics.
How do you make your mind jump the track? You have a really great knack for unhitching your brain to reconsider the possibilities of a given subject. How do you make your mind sort of jump the track like that?
I've got a good zoom lens. My wife and I often say of each other that she's got a very good wide-angle lens, and I've got a very good zoom lens. She's good at looking at a lot of different things and looking at relationships between them and keeping some kind of a balance between them. I'm very good at focusing on particular problems, and I think my talent is attention of a certain kind. I have extremely good powers of concentration. If there's a problem given to me, I'll immediately dive right into it, and I'm quite happy not to come out of it until I think I've made headway on it. In fact, I not only don't come out of it, I don't want to hear about any other problems. I don't have at all a wide-angle lens. I have to just stay on one thing, and then I'll stay on something else, you know. I don't find it hard to move from one thing to another. It's sort of a style I've developed. As long as I get long enough to spend on each thing, you know, to make some headway on it.
You've devised a series of games and tools for the production studio, which is your main instrument, the recording studio, that have helped other people kind of make their minds jump the track if you hit a blockade or if you get stalled on something. Could you describe some of those tools that you've put together?
Well, some of them are actual physical things. There's a pack of cards called Oblique Strategies, which is a set of, you might say, derailing instructions. They're cards, you pull a card and it tells you to do something, and very often that something is deliberately a technique for pushing you outside of the current terms of the situation you're in, so that you're made to reassess it differently, or to consider it from a viewpoint that you don't currently hold. Those have been very successful, and I use those a lot. I've lately been reducing those as I've produced people over the years. I've started to reduce those to some simpler formulas, like my current simple and very effective formula is cheap and fast.
Cheap and fast?
Yes, I think this is the most important message at the moment for people making pop records, that a lot can be done by just deciding in advance on a small budget and a short length of time. I think so much good work is ruined now by there just being an abundance, a luxury of time. The work loses its direction and gets all soft at the edges because there's too long to polish it. For me, the big cultural enemy is Hollywood, and the thing I call Hollywoodization is really the process of polishing something and cleaning it up, knocking off all the edges, submitting it to committee decisions so that everyone's satisfied they've got their little bit involved in it. And as I said before, finally making it triumphantly unnoticeable. So, everyone's so pleased because it finally looks like everything else you've ever seen. That seems to me to be the main aesthetic of Hollywood. And the thing I've always liked about popular music was that it constantly threw up weird new hybrids. Sometimes this was purely technical, people recording in situations that were quite out of control. One of the reasons one likes old records from the 50s and 60s is because they are acoustically so weird often, because the people recording them really didn't know what they were doing and didn't have very good equipment, and ended up with things that just sound absolutely beautiful, so absolutely strange. Rather like early photography. Early photography has qualities because of its limitations. Well, we don't have those same recording limitations now, and the temptation is to try to bring everything up to CD standard gloss, and I think it's terribly boring. I mean, just compare it with painting. You go to Temporary Contemporary in Los Angeles and you see the freedom with which modern painting is being conducted. Somebody does pictures that are 9 inches square, then you see next to it a Frank Stella that's 78 feet long, then you see someone working with sort of coarse metal filings stuck onto a board, then somebody else working with very fine oil paint. Just the difference in the number of surfaces is so impressive. And then you look at films and you look at records, and you can see what a terrible focusing exercise has gone on to produce actually a very small number of surfaces. It's very limited, and it doesn't explore any of the dirtier sides of how things could be. This is why European films always look so much more interesting, I think. It's not that the filmmakers are better or anything like that necessarily. It's just that they've got less money, so they necessarily produce things that have stranger and cruder and less polished looks to them. Crudeness invites the imagination, I think. Polish repels it.
Have you thought much about the medium of radio? Say if you had a radio station, what you might do with it?
Well, I must say, as I said, I was quite impressed with the K-Rock thing last night, though I think it's a bit of a trick in that its ostensible purpose for existing is not really what it's doing. It sort of takes advantage of the people who call in. Nonetheless, it's a brilliant idea for a radio show. I, of course, love radio drama. There's a big tradition of that in England, and I much prefer radio drama to television drama. I find it very, very involving, and it really drags you in somehow. There's something very exciting about just hearing a voice, a disembodied voice, not seeing a face and not seeing costumes and not seeing sets and not being aware of the theatricality of the event. Just hearing a single voice is very powerful. I don't think I've ever heard any radio drama in America, actually. That it's not very popular here, is it?
No, but it's about a third of what we do here at KCRW.
Mm-hmm.
It's a vital part of the station here.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's big in England as well, and also very popular. A lot of people listen to British radio drama. It even competes with television.
You're listening to Morning Becomes Eclectic on KCRW. I'm Chris Douridas, and we have in the studio Brian Eno. on the occasion of the release of NerveNet, which is a new release. It's in stores now on Opel Warner Brothers, and in the background what we're hearing is the ambient project, the Shutov Assembly, that is due out in late October. Here's one from NerveNet on KCRW's Morning Becomes Eclectic. It's called Juju Space Jazz, from the new release by Brian Eno called NerveNet, out on Opel Warner Brothers Records this week. I'm Chris Douridas. You're listening to Morning Becomes Eclectic on KCRW, and Brian Eno is in the studio. Brian, what would you like to do now that you haven't done? Is there anything that you haven't done you'd want to do?
Do you know, I never think about the future that much in that sense, in terms of thinking of having goals lined up like that. I'm always in the process of doing something, and so what I'm normally thinking of is, right, now I'm going to get this one finished, you know. Mm-hmm. So what I'm working on at the moment is I want to set a number of acoustic experiments to music. So I want to describe the experiments in language, in speech, and have the music as a demonstration of them, but as music at the same time. I'm working on one at the moment which is to do with interference patterns between very high frequencies. So this is rather a strange experiment. Another attempt to catapult myself to the top of the top 40.
Yeah. Let me throw a few things at you here and get your reactions to these. Just words, and just give me what comes to mind. When you think of the words Los Angeles.
Visually exhausting. Too spread out. Hollywood, unfortunately, I think of as well. Lovely sunsets. Girls with enlarged breasts and reduced noses. That's about Los Angeles for me.
Jane Siberry.
Well, I've just been working with her, so it's difficult to try to think of anything simple to say. I think a lot of things about her. She's a very mysterious person, and she's one of the best people to work with that I've ever met. She's capable of removing herself from the process and letting it flow on without her, and not being frightened of that process taking place. So what's the opposite of paranoid? She's the opposite of that.
Guileless? I don't know.
Yes, the opposite of overprotective. She's very confident in her work surviving without her continually defending it. She's a very good person to work with for that reason.
Ethnic fighting.
Oh, rootism, that reminds me of. I have this word rootism, which just about describes everything that I don't want to be interested in. Rootism is the notion that, another word for it is fundamentalism, I suppose. The notion that that one owes allegiance to a particular background, to a particular set of roots, or that one's existence is validated by them in some way. I think this is a very big problem in America. America, I always say, is one of my favorite countries, and also one of the most fundamentalist countries in the world. I think America and Iran are the most fundamentalist countries now. And the way the presidential election is being run at the moment is deliberately as an appeal to fundamentalism, and actually as an appeal to a kind of a set of ethnic assumptions, which are specifically white, lower middle class ethnic assumptions, I think. I think this is a very big problem for the future, and I think it's one of the important things about artists now, that one of the important things they can do is to exercise the strengths and joys of being uncertain, being confused, not owing allegiance or gaining strength from a very absolute set of values. So I would want to set up the the sort of contrary mindset to the one that's currently dominating your election, the one that says we really don't know the answers, and that's the only way we can operate. That's the only assumption upon which we can operate, that we're all guessing.
You just took care of a few things that I was going to cover on this, the American presidency and religious fundamentalism. And let's jump ahead here. Tell me about Barcelona.
I have a lot of connections with Barcelona. Not least that they just offered me the post of cultural director of the city
No,
a
really?
few months ago, yeah.
Did you accept?
No, I didn't, because I'm sure it would be a highly political post. I'm sure it would mean that I spent most of my time sitting in committee meetings. But I said I would like to be a consultant, if that was all right with them. Barcelona's a city that I became interested in about 20 years ago. It's a very extraordinary European city. It's always had a very strong identity of its own. It was very vigorously anti-Franco, and he was very vigorously anti-Barcelona. And it's always a city that's taken pride in its ability to spot and support the most cutting-edge aspects of culture. And unlike England, England is very proud of its ability to spot and support the past, which isn't so hard to do. You know, we have a heritage minister in England, a guy whose job is to defend our history, basically. We don't have a minister for the future, for example. We don't have anyone who's actually concerned with what we're doing now and what implications that has. We only have people defending the past. Well, Barcelona is rather the opposite. It's a city that has a lot of people who are sometimes quite sort of naively committed to the future. It has a staff, the city council is mostly people in their early 40s. It's quite surprising to walk into a room where the city architect is a beautiful middle-aged woman, not a grey-haired, austere old man, you know. So it's a city that I think has all the promise of what the new Europe could be like. Rostock has all the threat of what the new Europe could be like. Rostock is the place where all those neo-Nazi demonstrations have been going on.
We have just about a minute left, if you can believe it. Things have just been flying by here. But let me mention that Barcelona is also the place that you have presented a proposal for a theme park, a real-world theme park that would be a collaborative project between you and Peter Gabriel and Laurie Anderson. Can you say just a word about that?
Yeah, the word theme park is difficult because I know exactly what you must think of here when you hear the word theme park, having several of them just down the street. I suppose this grew out of the recognition that parks were... Sorry?
We have about 30 seconds, I'm sorry.
Oh dear. Well, that's
I know,
never asked me a big question with 30 seconds left.
That is a big question.
It's a place... We want it to be a place where artists can make a park. Artists and technologists, not a sort of elevated hamburger joint, you know. We want somewhere where the concept of art gallery ceases to exist, and where you go to a park which is semi-synthetic, semi-real. I can't answer this question in a short time.
I know.
We've been working on it for 5 years now.
Yeah.
It doesn't reduce to 30 seconds.
Well, let me just ask you quickly and succinctly, has it been approved? Is it going to go through?
Yeah, we're pretty sure it will. We're 99% sure it will. This is a big project. It involves a lot of money, and the final approval will be given this month. But it seems to be pretty settled, I think.
We'll watch closely and let people know how it's coming
Great.
along, and tell them more about it next week or something.
Okay.
Thanks so much for your time, Brian.
All right.
It's been great having you here, and thanks to Bill Bentley for bringing it down.